Welcome again, Forward in Hope. We've got great news for Small Heath here today once more. And if you had watched the previous video I was mentioning there the wonderful verse that Jesus Christ himself, he says, "I am the way, the truth and the life. No man cometh to the Father but by me." Here we see a proclamation from Christ himself, and he is proclaiming to be the only way back to God, the only way of salvation. I am the way, the truth and the life. What I want to do today is just to go all the way back to the beginning and to show that this idea that there is but one way back to God is something that's consistent all the way through the Bible. Now when we turn right to the very beginning of our Bibles in Genesis, there we read of the fall of man. The Bible, of course, has been put together in a chronological way. And so it starts with creation in the beginning, and then you come God having made man and placed man in the Garden of Eden on the earth. He says this is very good, and this is a place where God came to dwell with man on earth. And that's another theme that we could address another time, to show throughout the scriptures how that God is a God who desires to come close, to come down to be with us. But of course, when you come to chapter 3 of Genesis, we read of the fall of man and how Adam and Eve, they disobeyed God and they took of the fruit that they were forbidden to take, and sin came into this world. Now we read at the end of that chapter, we read there in the very last verse of this chapter, as God has come down and he's brought judgment upon these man and the woman in different ways, he then says, "So he drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubim and a flaming sword, which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life." So here we find, because man has now sinned, and because God is absolutely holy, and by holy we do not just mean that God is separate from his creation. No, God is not separate from his creation. He is other than creation. He is outside of creation. He is the creator, of course. But as we've already said, he is a God who loves to come into his creation and to fellowship with man and woman in his creation. God has already been here, dwelling in the Garden of Eden on earth. But now this is a holy place, because this is the place where God dwells. And now man and woman, because they are now characterized by sin and have a sin nature, they can no longer dwell in the presence of God. They must be driven out. And there is these angels, the cherubim. These are angels of judgment. And there they are, standing with flaming sword to bar the way, so that man could not again come into the garden, come into the presence of God, and to eat of the tree of life. Now, when you come to the very next chapter, chapter 4 of Genesis, there we read about then Adam and Eve's children. And we read of Cain and we read of Abel. Now, we find that they are introduced to us bringing an offering to God. You see, man has the desire to come to God and to come and worship God. We have this inbuilt instinct to worship, and it's good if we want to worship God. But what we learn from this story of Cain and Abel is that we must come to worship God in a way that's appropriate. Now, you have this story in the Quran as well. And in the Quran, I think they're given different names. Abel and Cable or something like that. Excuse my pronunciations. But you have the story in the Quran. And in the Quran, it does tell you that they brought an offering. It doesn't tell you what the offering was, but it just tells you they brought an offering to God. And then it also tells you in the Quran that God accepted Abel's offering, but did not accept Cain's offering. But then it doesn't explain why. It doesn't tell us why one was accepted, why another wasn't accepted. It just leaves that hanging. But when we come to the Bible, we find that these things are made clear. And what we read is this, that Cain, verse 3 of chapter 4 of Genesis, Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering to the Lord. So he brought an offering an offering that was of the fruit of the ground, something that he had worked with. It was the fruits of his labours in the fields, the wheat, the barley, the apples, whatever it was, and he brought that, and he brought it to the Lord. Now, it was likely the best of his provisions, and he brought that to the Lord, but it wasn't accepted. And then we find that Abel, he brings his offering. And Abel's offering, it says, he brought the firstling of his flock and of the fat. And it said the Lord accepted Abel's offering. Now that tells us that there is something intrinsically important as to the kind of offering we bring to God, and whether it is suitable to be accepted by a holy God as payment of sin. You see, with the fruit of the ground, there was no blood there. So there was nothing to pay for the sins of the people. You see, the Bible makes it clear that the wages of sin is death. And if we are to pay for the sin that we have done, then there must be death. There must be blood that is shed. There must be sacrifice, and a sacrifice that involves death and blood that is shed. You see, it tells us in the Bible that the life is in the blood. And so we're giving a life for a life in sacrifice. But Cain's offering didn't do that. Now, Cain's offering was no doubt a very good offering. It was the best that he could bring. And you know, Cain's offering speaks to us very much of religious activity. You know, things like prayer. You might sacrifice a lot to pray 5 times a day. You might sacrifice a lot to give to charity. You might sacrifice a lot to go on pilgrimage. All of those are sacrifices, yes, but they're not the right types of sacrifices, because they do not contain blood and they do not involve death. And therefore there is no payment in that. In all of that sacrifice, you could do all of that all your life. You could pray 5 times a day, every day, all of your life. You could go on pilgrimage multiple times. You could give almost all your money to charity. And yet all of that would never be enough to make atonement for your sin. You see, there is to be a sacrifice. There has to be death. There has to be blood that is shed. And that's what Abel brought. He brought the firstling of his flock to God. He sacrificed it. The blood was shed. And it says God had respect to his offering. God accepted his offering. And there Abel was brought in again to fellowship with God. You see, that angel with the flaming sword, the sword fell upon the animal. And now Abel was able to go in to the presence of God. Now when we come to the New Testament, we learn this, that the greatest prophet of all time, well, that's what Jesus called him anyway, John the Baptist, he said he's the greatest prophet. He said, as he pointed to Jesus Christ, he said, "Behold the Lamb of God, which takes away the sin of the world." Now here is a sacrifice that is far greater than any animal sacrifice. It is a sacrifice far greater than any man's sacrifice. For indeed it is the sacrifice of the Son of God, the one who is eternally God, but yet became truly human. God who became man to die for us. And there we find one who has given his life, shed his blood, and gone into death. A life for a life. His life, the life of one man, Jesus Christ, for all the lives of this world. You see, the infiniteness of Christ's sacrifice hangs upon the infiniteness of his nature. He is God, eternal, without measure, and therefore his sacrifice is one that can pay for all. It can pay for you. And he died for us. God accepted Christ as a sacrifice. He accepted Christ as a sacrifice because Jesus Christ rose from the dead again. And there we read that his very resurrection is a declaration to us that he is the Son of God and he has the power to save. And God has accepted that sacrifice, and Jesus Christ has gone in through the veil, in past the angel with the flaming sword. He's gone in with his own blood, and now he can bring us in. The way is now open because his death has satisfied God's judgment. And now you and I can come in. If we come simply with the right sacrifice, we must bow at the cross. We must accept that Jesus died for me, and we must put our identification upon him and claim his sacrifice as our sacrifice. And there we find that we can have salvation, and we can have life eternal, and we can be brought again into fellowship with the living God. What a wonderful thing it is to know God in that way, in that close way, walking with us, talking with us, and we can enjoy his presence. What a wonderful thing it is. And we hope you would have that too. And we trust that you will just think upon these things. There is but one way back to God, and it is through Jesus Christ and him crucified. May God bless you today. Thanks for listening.